On a cold March morning in 1997, in the quiet hills of Vermont, a young woman named Sarah Bennett left her small apartment to walk to her job at the local library. She was 23 years old, a recent graduate from the state university, with auburn hair that fell past her shoulders and a smile that regulars at the library had come to expect each weekday morning. Sarah had moved to the town of Hartwick, population 3,200, just 8 months earlier, drawn by the promise of affordable rent and the kind of peaceful existence that seemed to exist only in places where everyone knew their neighbors' names. She never made it to work that day. Her body was discovered 4 days later in a wooded area 7 miles outside of town, and what followed was a mystery that would haunt this community for nearly 3 decades. The question that lingered in the minds of investigators, family members, and residents of Hartwick was not simply who had taken Sarah's life, but how someone could live among them for so long, hiding such a terrible truth. Clear's throat. How does a person carry that weight for 27 years? Hartwick sits in the northeastern corner of Vermont, tucked between rolling hills that turn brilliant shades of orange and red each autumn and remain buried under snow for much of the winter. In 1997, the town consisted of a single main street lined with brick buildings from the late 1800s, a general store that sold everything from groceries to fishing licenses, 2 churches, and a library that occupied the ground floor of what had once been the town hall. The nearest city of any size was 45 minutes away by car, and most residents liked it that way. This was a place where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode their bicycles until dark without supervision, where the biggest news story might be the outcome of a high school basketball game or a debate over whether to repave Main Street. Sarah Bennett had grown up 3 hours south, in a suburb outside of Burlington, the oldest of 3 daughters born to Michael and Patricia Bennett. Her father worked as an accountant, her mother as a nurse at the regional hospital. Sarah had been studious and quiet as a child, the kind of girl who spent her allowance on books and who volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. She attended the University of Vermont, majoring in English literature, and graduated with honors in May of 1996. The job in Hartwick had come through a friend of a friend. The previous librarian was retiring, and they needed someone to manage the collection and help patrons with research requests. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but Sarah had told her mother during a phone call that first week that she loved the quietness of the place, the way she could hear birdsong through the library windows, the way people said good morning when they passed on the street. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment above the pharmacy on Main Street. The landlord, an elderly man named Robert Carlson who owned the building and the pharmacy below, had lived in Hartwick his entire life. He later told investigators that Sarah was an ideal tenant, quiet, always paid rent on time, kept the place clean. She had very little furniture when she moved in. A bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf already overflowing with volumes she had collected over the years. On the walls, she had hung framed prints of classic book covers and a calendar featuring photographs of national parks. Her routine was consistent. She woke each morning at 6:30, made coffee in the small kitchen, and spent an hour reading before getting ready for work. The library opened at 9, and Sarah's walk from her apartment took exactly 12 minutes. She would stop at the general store twice a week to pick up groceries, always on Tuesday and Friday afternoons. On weekends, she would drive to the nearest bookstore or take long walks on the trails that wound through the hills surrounding Hartwick. She spoke to her mother by phone every Sunday evening. She had gone on 2 dates with a man named Thomas Reed, a teacher at the elementary school, though both later said there was no romantic connection, just pleasant conversation over dinner. March 14, 1997 began like any other Friday. The temperature hovered around 38 degrees, the sky overcast with the kind of gray clouds that promised snow but had not yet delivered. Sarah woke at her usual time, made her coffee, sat by the window reading a novel she had started the night before. At 8:15, she dressed in jeans, a burgundy sweater and her winter coat, a dark green parka she had owned since college. She pulled on her boots, wound a cream-colored scarf around her neck, and locked the door behind her at 8:47. Clear's throat, Robert Carlson, opening the pharmacy downstairs at that very moment, waved to her as she descended the exterior staircase. He would later tell police that she smiled and said good morning, that she seemed no different than she had on any other day. Sarah turned left onto Main Street, walking north toward the library. The general store owner, Margaret Kowalski, saw her pass by the front window at approximately 8:50. Two other residents would later confirm seeing her walking along that familiar route, but Sarah never arrived at the library. The head librarian, Dorothy Marsh, who had been training Sarah and planned to fully retire at the end of the month, waited until 9:15 before calling Sarah's apartment. No answer. She tried again at 9:30, then 10. By 10:30, Dorothy walked to Sarah's apartment and knocked on the door. Nothing. She returned to the library and called Sarah's landlord, who used his key to check the apartment. Everything appeared normal, bed made, dishes washed and put away, the novel still sitting on the table by the window, open to the page Sarah had been reading that morning. Dorothy contacted the Hartwick Police Department at 11:12. The department consisted of Chief Harold Simmons and 3 officers who served a town where serious incidents were rare. Chief Simmons initially treated Sarah's absence as a possible misunderstanding. Perhaps she had felt ill and decided to stay home. Perhaps she had gone for a walk and lost track of time. But as the afternoon wore on and there was still no sign of Sarah, no response to calls, no activity at her apartment, the chief's concern deepened. By 4 o'clock, he had contacted the state police and requested assistance in organizing a search. The search began that evening, March 14, just as the sun was setting behind the hills. Volunteers gathered at the town hall, neighbors, shopkeepers, parents with children too young to help who stayed behind and prepared coffee and sandwiches for the searchers. They divided into teams, each assigned a section of town and the surrounding areas. They walked the streets calling Sarah's name, checked behind buildings, looked in drainage ditches and vacant lots. The temperature dropped below freezing after dark, and snow began to fall lightly, dusting the ground and the shoulders of those who continued searching through the night. On Saturday morning, more volunteers arrived. The state police brought tracking dogs. The search expanded to the woods and trails outside of town, to the old logging roads that wound through the forest, to the banks of Hartwick Creek, which ran cold and swift with snowmelt. Sarah's parents drove up from Burlington, arriving Saturday afternoon. Patricia Bennett would later describe the feeling of walking through a town where her daughter had lived, seeing her apartment, her books, her clothes hanging in the closet, and not knowing where she was or what had happened. Michael Bennett joined the search teams, walking through the woods until his legs ached and his voice was hoarse from calling his daughter's name. Sunday brought no new leads. Monday morning, the search continued with renewed intensity, but the woods were vast, the terrain difficult. On Monday afternoon, March 17, a volunteer named James Porter, a local contractor who knew the area well, was searching a section of woods approximately 7 miles northeast of Hartwick. The area was accessible by a narrow dirt road that was rarely used except by hunters during deer season. James later told investigators that something caught his eye, a flash of color that did not belong among the brown tree trunks and the white snow. He approached slowly, then stopped. He immediately radioed for police. Sarah Bennett was found lying in a shallow depression beneath a cluster of pine trees. She was still wearing her green parka and cream-colored scarf. Her body showed signs of trauma that investigators would not immediately disclose to the public. The scene was secured, and forensic teams from the state police arrived to process the evidence. The medical examiner determined that Sarah had been deceased for several days, placing her time of passing on or very close to the morning she disappeared. The cause was listed as blunt force trauma to the head. There was no evidence of any other violence. Her purse was missing, never recovered. Her apartment keys were still in her coat pocket. The discovery devastated Hartwick. This was a community unaccustomed to such darkness, a place where people had believed they were safe, where parents had let their children play outside without fear. The library closed for a week. Flags on Main Street were lowered. A memorial service was held at the Methodist Church, attended by hundreds. Sarah's parents sat in the front pew, their faces pale and drawn, surrounded by people who had never met their daughter but who mourned her nonetheless. The investigation intensified immediately. State police detectives interviewed everyone who had seen Sarah that morning, everyone who knew her, everyone who had been in Hartwick on March 14. They reconstructed her final walk from her apartment toward the library, trying to determine the exact point where she had been taken. They searched for witnesses who might have seen a vehicle, heard a scream, noticed anything unusual. They found nothing. The dirt road where Sarah's body was discovered had no fresh tire tracks due to the snow that had fallen Friday night. There were no footprints that could be clearly identified. The forensic evidence from the scene was limited. A few fibers, soil samples, nothing that pointed immediately to a suspect. Those who knew Hartwick said the town changed after Sarah's body was found. Doors that had always been left unlocked were bolted shut. Parents began driving their children to school rather than letting them walk. People looked at strangers with suspicion, wondered about neighbors they had known for years. The question everyone asked was simple but impossible to answer. Who among them could have done this? Part 2. The investigation. The Vermont State Police established a command post in Hartwick, operating out of a conference room in the town hall. Lead Detective Raymond Torres, a 20-year veteran with experience in major investigations, coordinated the effort. Teams of detectives conducted interviews, collected physical evidence, reviewed Sarah's personal effects, phone records, bank statements. They built a timeline of her final days, looking for any deviation from her normal routine, any interaction that might have been significant. The search for evidence expanded beyond the immediate crime scene. Detectives walked the route Sarah would have taken from her apartment to the library, examining every side street, every alley, every place where someone might have forced her into a vehicle without being seen. They interviewed everyone who lived or worked along Main Street. Margaret Kowalski at the general store confirmed she had seen Sarah walk past at 8:50, moving at her normal pace, appearing completely ordinary. No one reported seeing her after that moment. The community response was overwhelming. Hundreds of volunteers assisted with searches of surrounding areas. The media descended on Hartwick, reporters from Burlington, from regional newspapers, even a crew from a Boston television station. The story of a young librarian taken from a peaceful Vermont town captured attention across New England. Tips began pouring into the state police hotline, reported sightings of Sarah before she disappeared, theories about potential suspects, observations about vehicles or strangers seen in the area. Each tip was investigated, documented, and filed. By the end of March, investigators had interviewed more than 200 people. They had collected fiber samples, soil samples, and photographs of the crime scene. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Sarah had been struck multiple times on the head with a blunt object, likely a heavy piece of wood or metal. The weapon was never recovered. Toxicology results showed no substances in her system. There was no evidence that anything else had been done to her before or after she was struck. Her coat pockets contained her apartment keys, a receipt from the general store dated 3 days before her disappearance, and a bookmark shaped like a cat. Detective Torres and his team developed a list of potential suspects based on proximity, opportunity, and behavior. They looked at anyone with a criminal history in the area, anyone who had shown unusual interest in Sarah, anyone whose story contained inconsistencies. They interviewed Robert Carlson extensively. He had been one of the last people to see Sarah alive. He had access to her apartment. He knew her routine. But Carlson's alibi was solid. He had been in the pharmacy all morning on March 14, serving customers who confirmed his presence. He was 72 years old, with no criminal record, no history of any incidents. Investigators found nothing to suggest his involvement. They interviewed Thomas Reed, the elementary school teacher Sarah had dated briefly. Reed explained that they had gone to dinner twice in February but decided they were better as friends. He had been at school all day on March 14, teaching a classroom of second graders with multiple witnesses. His vehicle was inspected and showed no evidence connecting him to the crime. His phone records revealed no suspicious calls. Investigators cleared him. They expanded their search to include registered offenders in the region, individuals with histories of violence, anyone who had recently been released from custody. Each lead required hours of investigation, interviews, verification of whereabouts. None led anywhere substantial. Then in early April, investigators turned their attention to a man named Derek Coleman. Coleman was 31 years old in 1997, a Hartwick native who worked construction and odd jobs around town. He lived alone in a small house on the eastern edge of Hartwick, about a mile from Main Street. He was known in the community as quiet, somewhat withdrawn, a man who kept to himself. Those who knew him said he was reliable when it came to work. He showed up on time, completed jobs competently, rarely spoke more than necessary. He had never been married, had no children, spent most of his evenings at home or occasionally at the town's single bar, where he would nurse a beer in silence before walking home. What drew investigators' attention to Derek Coleman was a series of small inconsistencies that began to accumulate. First, a witness reported seeing Coleman's truck, a faded blue Chevrolet from the late 1980s, parked on a side street near Main Street on the morning of March 14, around 8:30. This was unusual because Coleman typically did not come into town that early unless he had a job scheduled, and investigators could find no record of him working that day. When questioned, Coleman said he had driven into town to pick up supplies at the general store, but Margaret Kowalski had no memory of him being there that morning, and a review of the store's receipts showed no purchase under his name. Second, Coleman had scratches on his hands and forearms when investigators first interviewed him on March 18, 4 days after Sarah's disappearance. When asked about them, he said he had been clearing brush behind his house. Neighbors could not confirm seeing him doing yard work that week, though that did not necessarily mean it had not happened. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Coleman had no clear alibi for the morning of March 14. He told investigators he had been home alone, that he had spent the morning doing chores around his property, that he had not left except for the brief trip into town. There was no one who could verify his account. For most people in Hartwick, this would not have been unusual. Many residents spent time alone, worked on their properties, lived independent lives. But in the context of an investigation into abduction and ending of a life, The lack of an alibi raised questions. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Coleman's property on April 8. They brought forensic teams, cadaver dogs, and equipment to examine his truck, his house, his tools. They spent 12 hours going through every room, every outbuilding, every inch of his yard. They found nothing directly connecting him to Sarah Bennett. No traces of her blood, no fibers matching her clothing, no personal items. The soil on Coleman's property did not match the soil samples from the crime scene. The odometer reading on his truck did not reflect the additional 14 miles it would have required to drive from Hartwick to the location where Sarah's body was found and back. But they did find something that troubled them. In Coleman's bedroom, in a drawer beneath folded clothes, investigators found a collection of newspaper clippings. The clippings were all from local newspapers, dating back several years, and they all featured stories about young women, engagement announcements, scholarship awards, obituaries, feature articles. Sarah Bennett was not among them, but the collection itself struck investigators as odd. When questioned, Coleman said he had no explanation for the clippings, that he did not remember cutting them out or saving them. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Coleman's demeanor during the search. He had been calm, almost unnaturally so, watching as investigators dismantled his life piece by piece. He answered questions in a flat, emotionless tone. He did not appear angry or defensive or scared. He simply watched and waited, and that stillness unsettled the men and women who were trained to read human behavior. Despite their suspicions, investigators did not have enough evidence to arrest Derek Coleman. The scratches on his hands could have come from yard work. The truck sighting could have been explained by a trip to town he had forgotten to mention. The newspaper clippings were strange but not illegal. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, without witnesses placing him with Sarah, without a confession, the case against Coleman was circumstantial at best. Through the spring and summer of 1997, investigators continued pursuing other leads. They interviewed transients who had been passing through the area, truck drivers who regularly used the highways near Hartwick, utility workers who had been in town that week. They reviewed surveillance footage from the few businesses that had security cameras, though none captured anything useful. They consulted with forensic psychologists who developed profiles of the likely perpetrator, someone familiar with the area, someone who had access to a vehicle, someone who could blend into the community without raising suspicion. Derek Coleman remained a person of interest, but as months passed without new evidence, the intensity of the investigation began to wane. The state police reduced their presence in Hartwick. The media moved on to other stories. Sarah's parents returned to Burlington, carrying with them a grief that would never fully heal. The tip line received fewer calls. The case files grew thicker but no closer to resolution. By the end of 1997, the investigation into Sarah Bennett's demise had effectively gone cold. Investigators had interviewed hundreds of people, processed volumes of evidence, pursued every credible lead, and still had no suspect they could charge. The file remained open, as all such cases do, but the active search for answers had slowed to a near standstill. Hartwick tried to return to normal, though everyone knew the town had been changed forever. People still locked their doors. Parents still watched their children more closely. And Derek Coleman continued living in his small house on the edge of town, working his construction jobs, keeping to himself, carrying whatever knowledge he possessed deep inside where no one could reach it. Those who have ever felt certain about someone's guilt without being able to prove it understand the frustration that haunted Detective Torres and his team. They had a suspect they believed was responsible. They had instincts honed over years of investigations. But instinct is not evidence, and suspicion is not proof. And in the eyes of the law, Derek Coleman was simply another resident of Hartwick, innocent until proven otherwise. Part 3. The silence. The years that followed moved slowly for everyone touched by Sarah Bennett's case. For her parents, Michael and Patricia, the loss created a void that could never be filled. They had buried their eldest daughter in May of 1997 in a cemetery overlooking the town where they had raised her, beneath a headstone that bore her name, her dates, and a simple inscription: "Beloved daughter, forever missed." Patricia returned to her work at the hospital, but colleagues noticed she was quieter now, more withdrawn. Michael continued with his accounting practice, but clients who had known him for years saw the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching. Sarah's two younger sisters, Jennifer and Amy, struggled in their own ways. Jennifer, who had been 19 when Sarah disappeared, dropped out of college for a semester, unable to focus on coursework while her family was shattered. She eventually returned and finished her degree, but she never spoke about that period of her life, never mentioned the sister who had been her closest friend. Amy, 16 at the time, became intensely private, building walls around herself that even her parents could not penetrate. She graduated high school, moved to Boston for college, and visited home less and less frequently as the years passed. For Detective Raymond Torres, the unsolved case became a weight he carried throughout the remainder of his career. He kept the file on his desk, reviewing it periodically, hoping some new detail would emerge or some piece of evidence would be re-examined with fresh technology. He called Sarah's parents every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, a conversation that became ritual but brought no comfort. When Torres retired from the Vermont State Police in 2009, he passed the file to a younger detective with instructions to never let it close, never stop looking, never forget Sarah Bennett. In Hartwick, life continued its steady rhythm, but the town never quite recovered its former innocence. The library hired a new librarian, a woman in her 50s who had relocated from New Hampshire. The apartment above the pharmacy was eventually rented to a young couple, though Robert Carlson always felt a pang when he saw them coming and going, remembering the quiet young woman who had lived there before. Dorothy Marsh, the head librarian who had been training Sarah, retired as planned but could never enter the library without thinking about that March morning when her new colleague had simply never arrived. Derek Coleman remained in Hartwick. In the years immediately following the investigation, he faced quiet suspicion from some residents. People would cross the street to avoid walking past him. Mothers would pull their children closer when his truck drove by. But as time passed and no charges were ever filed, no new evidence emerged, that suspicion gradually faded into uneasy acceptance. Coleman continued working construction, taking jobs around town and in neighboring communities. He showed up, did the work, collected his pay, and went home. He spoke little, made no friends, attended no social gatherings. Those who worked alongside him occasionally tried to engage him in conversation. A carpenter named Bill Henderson, who hired Coleman for a renovation project in 2003, later said that working with Derek was like working with a ghost. He was competent, skilled with tools, but he existed in a bubble of silence. During lunch breaks, while other workers sat together and talked about sports or families or weekend plans, Coleman would sit apart, eating a sandwich and staring at nothing in particular. When someone asked him a direct question, he would answer in the fewest words possible, then return to that distant silence. In 2005, Coleman's mother passed away. She had been living in a nursing facility for several years following a series of small incidents that had left her unable to care for herself. Coleman had visited her regularly, every Sunday afternoon, sitting by her bedside in silence for an hour before leaving. Those who worked at the facility said he never spoke to his mother during these visits, simply sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand. After her passing, Coleman arranged a simple memorial, attended by fewer than a dozen people. He sold his mother's house and put the money in a bank account he never touched. The years accumulated, 1998, 1999, 2000, marching forward through a new century while Sarah Bennett remained frozen at 23, her case growing colder with each passing season. New technologies emerged in forensic science. DNA analysis became more sophisticated, more sensitive. In 2008, investigators reopened several cold cases from the 1990s, re-examining evidence with modern techniques. Sarah's case was among them. The evidence collected in 1997 was carefully reviewed, retested, analyzed with methods that had not existed when she was found. But the results yielded nothing new. The fibers recovered from her clothing were too degraded. The soil samples contained no identifiable markers. There was no biological evidence that could be tested for DNA. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have looked at a father or brother or friend, and wondered what darkness might exist beneath the surface they present to the world, the story of what happened next will resonate with terrible familiarity. Clears throat, because sometimes the truth has been there all along, waiting for someone brave enough to speak it. In February 2018, 21 years after Sarah Bennett's body was found in those Vermont woods, the Hartwick Police Department received a phone call that would finally break the case open. The call came from a woman named Rachel Porter, who had grown up in Hartwick, but had moved to New Hampshire in her early 20s. Rachel was calling about her father, James Porter, the same man who had discovered Sarah's body during the search in March 1997. Rachel told the officer who answered the phone that she needed to speak with someone about an old case. She was 34 years old, married, mother of 2 children. She had not lived in Hartwick for more than a decade, but there was something she needed to say, something that had been eating at her for years, something she could no longer keep silent about. James Porter had passed away 3 weeks earlier in January 2018 from complications related to pneumonia. He was 68 years old. In the days following his passing, Rachel and her mother had been going through his belongings, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions. In the garage, in a metal filing cabinet that had been locked for as long as Rachel could remember, they found a key in her father's desk drawer. Inside the cabinet were file folders containing newspaper clippings about Sarah Bennett's case, photographs of the search efforts, copies of police reports that James should not have had access to. And beneath those files, wrapped in plastic, was a piece of wood approximately 18 inches long, dark stains on one end. Rachel's hands had been shaking when she found it. Her mother had stood beside her, both of them staring at the object neither wanted to acknowledge. They had called the police the next day. Part 4. The Revelation. The Hartwick Police Department immediately contacted the Vermont State Police. Detective Sarah Chen, who had taken over Sarah Bennett's cold case from Raymond Torres, drove to New Hampshire that same day to meet with Rachel Porter and her mother, Diane. The meeting took place at Rachel's home, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where her children played in the backyard, unaware of the conversation happening inside. Rachel explained that she had been 17 years old when Sarah Bennett disappeared. She remembered the search, remembered her father volunteering, remembered the day he came home and said he had found something in the woods. But she also remembered other things, details that had seemed insignificant at the time but had taken on new meaning over the years. She remembered her father washing his truck thoroughly on March 15, the day after Sarah disappeared, scrubbing it inside and out in the driveway even though the weather was cold and wet. She remembered him burning clothes in the backyard fire pit that same week, telling her mother he was getting rid of old work clothes. She remembered the way he had been different after Sarah's body was found, quieter, more withdrawn, jumping at sudden noises. "I was just a kid," Rachel told Detective Chen, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't understand what I was seeing. I didn't want to believe my father could do something like that. But as I got older, I started putting pieces together. The way he had known exactly where to find her. The way he had those files locked away. The way he would get angry if anyone mentioned the case. I tried to convince myself I was wrong, that I was imagining things, but I knew. Deep down, I knew." The piece of wood found in James Porter's locked cabinet was immediately sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Forensic technicians discovered blood in the wood grain that had been protected by the plastic wrapping. DNA extracted from that blood matched Sarah Bennett's profile, which had been entered into databases years earlier. Additional analysis revealed wood fibers that matched fibers collected from Sarah's clothing in 1997, fibers that at the time could not be definitively sourced. Detective Chen and her team began reconstructing James Porter's movements on March 14, 1997. They reviewed old interview notes from the original investigation. Porter had been interviewed along with all other volunteers, had stated he was home on the morning of March 14, had no alibi witnesses. His truck had been searched as part of the general investigation, but only superficially. He was a volunteer, a concerned community member, not a suspect. The deep cleaning he had given the truck the day after Sarah disappeared had eliminated any trace evidence that might have been present. Investigators now believed they could reconstruct what had happened. James Porter had been driving his truck into town on the morning of March 14, 1997. He encountered Sarah Bennett walking along Main Street toward the library. What motivated him to stop, to speak with her, to convince her to get into his truck, remained unclear. Perhaps he offered her a ride due to the cold weather. Perhaps he said something that made her trust him. He was a familiar face in a small town, a contractor who worked on buildings she passed every day. At some point during that brief encounter, something went terribly wrong. Porter drove Sarah out of town on that rarely used dirt road. What happened in those woods would never be fully known, but the evidence suggested he struck her with the piece of wood multiple times, causing the blunt force trauma that took her life. He left her body in that shallow depression beneath the pine trees, drove back to town, cleaned his truck, disposed of evidence. Then, 3 days later, he volunteered for the search and made sure he was the one who discovered her body, positioning himself as a hero rather than a suspect. For those who have ever wondered how someone could live with such knowledge, could look their family in the eyes every day while harboring such a secret, the answer lies in compartmentalization that defies understanding. James Porter had attended Sarah's memorial service. He had helped organize volunteer search efforts for other missing persons cases in subsequent years. He had coached youth baseball, served on the town planning board, lived what appeared to be an ordinary life while knowing exactly what he had done. The revelation shocked Hartwick once again. James Porter had been well liked in the community, respected as a businessman and volunteer. Many found it impossible to believe he could have been responsible for Sarah's demise, but the physical evidence was undeniable. The DNA on the wood matched Sarah's blood. The wood fibers matched those found on her clothing. The timeline fit perfectly with the last confirmed sighting of Sarah walking on Main Street. Because Porter had passed away before the evidence was discovered, there would be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for him to face justice in a courtroom. But for Sarah's family, for the investigators who had worked the case, for the community that had lived with the mystery for more than 2 decades, the revelation brought a form of closure that had seemed impossible. Detective Raymond Torres, long retired, received a call from Sarah Chen informing him that the case had been solved. He sat in his kitchen in silence for several minutes after the call ended, processing the information. He had suspected Derek Coleman for years, had been wrong about the identity of the perpetrator, but right that someone in Hartwick had been responsible. He thought about all the hours spent investigating, all the interviews, all the evidence that had pointed nowhere. And he thought about Sarah Bennett, the young librarian who had simply wanted to walk to work on a March morning, who had trusted someone she should have been able to trust, who had paid for that trust with her life. On March 14, 2024, 27 years to the day after Sarah Bennett disappeared, a memorial was held at the Hartwick Library. Sarah's mother, Patricia, now in her 70s, attended along with her daughters Jennifer and Amy. Dorothy Marsh, the former head librarian who had been 93 years old, came in a wheelchair. Residents of Hartwick filled the library, standing shoulder to shoulder among the bookshelves, many of them too young to remember Sarah but knowing her story, understanding what her case had meant to their community. A plaque was unveiled near the library entrance, bearing Sarah's photograph and a simple inscription: Sarah Bennett, 1973-1997, librarian, daughter, friend. She brought knowledge and kindness to this community. She is remembered. Beside her photograph, the library displayed a quote Sarah had written in her college yearbook: "Books are how we know we are not alone." The case was officially closed in May 2024. The state police held a press conference where they explained the evidence that had led them to conclude James Porter was responsible for Sarah Bennett's demise. They acknowledged the limitations of not being able to bring the perpetrator to trial, but emphasized that the truth had finally emerged, that Sarah's family finally had answers. Rachel Porter released a statement through her attorney expressing her deep sorrow for what her father had done and her sympathy for Sarah's family. "I wish I had spoken sooner," the statement read. "I wish I had trusted my instincts as a teenager. I cannot change the past, but I hope that by coming forward now, I have helped bring some measure of peace to those who loved Sarah and have waited so long for the truth." Derek Coleman, who had lived under suspicion for years, received a formal letter from the Vermont State Police acknowledging that he had been investigated as a person of interest and that the case resolution cleared him of any involvement. Coleman, now in his late 50s, did not respond publicly. He continued living in his small house, working his construction jobs, maintaining the solitary existence he had always known. The swing hung still in the small park across from the library, the same park where children had played while Sarah worked at the desk inside. The toy truck lay on its side in the sandbox where a child had left it. Life continued in Hartwick, but the town carried with it now not just the memory of tragedy, but the knowledge that truth, however long delayed, could still emerge from silence. Closing. Sarah Bennett's case reminds us that justice does not always arrive according to our timelines, that truth can remain hidden for decades before emerging into light, that even in the smallest communities, darkness can exist behind familiar faces. The investigation that began in 1997 and concluded in 2024 spanned a generation, touched countless lives, and demonstrated both the limitations and the persistence of those who seek answers for the victims who can no longer speak. Sarah Bennett was 23 years old when her life was taken, a young woman who loved books and quiet places, who had moved to a small Vermont town seeking peace and found instead an encounter that should never have happened. She is remembered not for how she passed, but for who she was: kind, studious, hopeful about the future. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.